The last of the evening light was dying out as I pulled up to the dusty old farmhouse. Its warped wood and chipped paint looked more haunted than homey, whispering forgotten tales of a past life. My work as a journalist had brought me to this remote corner of Navajo Nation in Arizona to write about their culture and traditions. Little did I know that the path would lead me into the obscure world of the unexplained and eerie. Dylan Johnson, I introduced myself, reaching out to the frail old man on the porch. His eyes were deep-set, partially veiled by a crinkly veil of age. He took my hand, his grip feeble but welcoming. "Call me Yiska," he replied, his voice as gruff as the windswept desert around us. I followed him into the house, the scent of sage and dust heavy in the air. We spent the first hour talking about the Navajo way of life, their stories, rituals, and beliefs. It wasn't until Yiska started sharing tales from the darker side of Navajo lore that the night truly began. He spoke of shapeshifters, witches, and unworldly creatures, each more chilling than the last. But one story that he hesitated to speak of caught my attention, a story of the yiska, the Skinwalker. Yiska's gaze seemed to gaze past me, and his voice fell to a hush as he told me the tale. The Skinwalker, he explained, was a vile creature, a witch that could take the form of any animal, a bearer of death and despair. "You don't find Skinwalkers," he said ominously. "They find you." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the desert heat. There was a seriousness in his tone that made me uneasy. Suddenly, the wind outside picked up, its moan a mournful echo to the old man's tales. Do these Skinwalkers exist?" I asked, curiosity overcoming my fear. Yiska glanced at me, his eyes reflecting the flicker of the single lamp that was our only light source. "There's a reason we don't speak of them lightly," he said. I left his house, my mind teeming with tales of the supernatural. The sun had fully set now, and the desert was bathed in an eerie darkness. I climbed into my car, parked a small distance away. The tales seemed distant now, far from the chill reality of the desert night. I started the car and was about to pull onto the dusty road when my headlights illuminated a figure standing on the road. A figure that wasn't there a moment ago. My breath hitched. It was a dog, or rather the grotesque caricature of one, with gleaming red eyes that stared straight back at me, unnervingly human. My blood froze as it stood there, defiant in the glow of my headlights, a silent sentinel of the dark. For a moment, I remembered Yiska's words. "You don't find Skinwalkers, they find you." The words echoed ominously in the darkened car as I stared at the creature, its red eyes never leaving mine. An unsettling feeling crept up on me, the once comforting isolation of the desert now a chilling void. In the pitch-black landscape of Navajo Nation, my mind spun with stories of the yiska. I couldn't help but wonder, had I just met the Skinwalker from Yiska's tale? The beginnings of fear took root in my mind, promising a sleepless night. As I sat there, trapped in the high beams with the creature, I realized this story had taken a darker turn. There was more here than just cultural journalism. Something was happening in this corner of the Navajo Nation, and I was right in the middle of it. From the darkness of the night, an otherworldly howl shattered the silence, jolting me from my paralyzing reverie. The creature before me responded with a chilling snarl, its eyes still locked with mine. Then, in an almost surreal fluidity, it turned and darted off the road, disappearing into the shadowy abyss. I sat in the eerie silence that followed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribcage. Questions stormed through my mind as I grappled with what I had seen. Was this the result of the sinister folklore Yiska had filled my head with? Was I now a character in my own nightmarish tale? Only the silent desert held the answers. Leaving the disturbing encounter behind, I drove back to the small motel I was residing in, nestled on the outskirts of the Navajo Nation. It was a long, sleepless night. The apparition I'd seen on the road kept creeping back into my mind, Yiska's words echoing ominously. "You don't find Skinwalkers, they find you." I couldn't shake off the feeling that my encounter with the creature was far from over. The morning arrived with little respite. As the dawn's golden light filtered through the ragged curtains, I found myself at the local diner, trying to distract myself with a greasy breakfast and bitter coffee. News travels fast in small communities. Word about the city man who had spent the evening with Yiska had made its rounds. I could feel the curious stares from the locals. Some were intrigued, others skeptical, but most, I noticed, had a certain wariness in their eyes. Dylan, right? The waitress, a middle-aged Navajo woman named Maisie, had a kind smile and a candid demeanor. I nodded, pushing the uneaten breakfast around my plate. You know Yiska? Everyone knows Yiska, she responded, wiping down the counter with a worn cloth. He's a bit of a storyteller, keeps the old tales alive, keeps telling stories about them, Skinwalkers. The word seemed to hang in the air, dropping the diner into a sudden, uneasy silence. The word had an effect I couldn't explain. It was as if everyone had held their breath collectively, waiting for something. You know about them? I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Enough to know that we don't talk about them, she said, lowering her voice. I was about to ask more, but a sudden commotion outside interrupted us. A couple of men stood around a sheep pen, their faces contorted in confusion and fear. There were sounds of distress, of loss. I got up, my journalist's curiosity piqued, and walked towards the crowd. They were looking at a sheep, or rather, what remained of it. Its wool was matted with blood, its body unnaturally twisted. It looked like the work of a predator, but there was something eerie about it. The sheep's eyes were wide open, reflecting the fear of its last moments, and its mouth seemed to be stuck in a silent scream. Skinwalker, one of the men whispered, his face ashen, his eyes filled with a silent dread. I felt a chill run down my spine. The reality of Yiska's stories was unraveling in front of me. The desert silence took on a sinister note, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It felt as if something was lurking in the unseen corners of my vision. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in hues of orange and red, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The words of Yiska, the fearful expressions of the townsfolk, the butchered sheep, all pointed towards a reality that I was not prepared for. That night, as I lay in the motel bed, I could hear the distant howl of a coyote. It was a desolate sound that echoed in the vast expanse of the desert. It was a reminder of my isolation, of the distance from my familiar world. As sleep finally began to claim me, I was jerked awake by a tapping sound at my window. I held my breath, the sound of my heartbeat deafening in the silence. There it was again. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly I moved towards the window, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pulled the curtain aside, I saw them again, those gleaming red eyes, full of malice and a terrifying intelligence, staring right back at me. In the reflection of those hellish eyes, I knew. The Skinwalker had found me. The red eyes faded into the darkness as the first rays of dawn filtered in, bringing with them a sense of grim reality. The strange happenings, the sinister sightings, the townsfolk's whispers, all were becoming more frequent. And in the center of it all was the chilling figure of the Skinwalker, an increasingly horrifying presence in my life. As days turned into a week, I noticed a change in the air. The people of the Navajo Nation grew wary, their lives dominated by an undercurrent of fear. Unexplained events were whispered about in hushed tones: mutilated livestock, nocturnal apparitions, and an eerie presence that seemed to stalk the moonlit desert. The once vibrant community was now living under the ominous shadow of the Skinwalker. Feeling more lost than ever, I decided to visit Yiska once more. I needed his wisdom, his knowledge about this phenomenon that was slowly turning my life into a living nightmare. Yiska, albeit surprised by my sudden visit, welcomed me in. His farmhouse, bathed in the harsh desert sun, seemed less comforting than before. Dylan, Yiska's voice broke the silence. You've seen it again, haven't you? His question wasn't surprising. I nodded, recounting the events of the past few nights, the terrifying figure at my window, the unsettling eyes watching me from the dark. He listened, his deep-set eyes holding an understanding I wasn't sure I wanted. When I finished, Yiska was silent for what felt like an eternity. The weight of his gaze was heavy, filled with an unspoken truth that I wasn't ready to hear. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been marked, Dylan. The Skinwalker has chosen you." A chill ran down my spine at his words. Marked? Chosen for what? For its attention. "You must leave," he implored. I felt a mix of fear and rebellion at his words. "I need to understand, to document." Yiska cut me off, shaking his head slowly. "Some things are not meant to be understood. Some stories are not meant to be told. This is bigger than you or your story." His words echoed in my mind as I drove back to the motel. I couldn't just leave, not when I was so entwined in this mystery. But the events of that night made me reconsider. In the deep silence of the desert night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. A bone-chilling howl that echoed around the room. In the faint moonlight filtering through the curtain, I saw it. The grotesque figure, half human, half beast, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. The terror I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a primal fear, the kind that gnaws at your sanity and questions your understanding of reality. As I looked into the menacing eyes of the Skinwalker, I realized that Yiska was right. I had to leave. Packing was a blur, my hands moving almost of their own accord. Fear is a potent motivator, stripping away all non-essentials, focusing only on the present danger. The creature's howl still echoed in my ears, a chilling soundtrack to my hurried escape. The car's engine roared to life, a comforting rumble in the oppressive silence of the desert night. The barren landscape stretched before me, a blanket of darkness, only interrupted by the beams of my headlights. As I drove, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the red eyes watching me, a constant reminder of the unnatural horror I was leaving behind. The road seemed endless, a continuous loop of dust and darkness. Halfway to the town's border, my headlights flickered. The engine sputtered, as if gasping for breath. Then, with a shudder, the car died. The silence was deafening, a wall of absolute stillness that seemed to amplify my rapidly beating heart. Stranded in the middle of the desert, in the heart of Skinwalker territory, I had never felt so vulnerable. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. A figure stepped into the edges of the dimmed headlights, its form flickering like a mirage. I knew, even before I saw them, the eyes that would be looking back at me. The creature stood there watching, its form rippling between man and beast. I could see its eyes clearly now, glowing with an unholy light, burning with an intelligence that was far from human. In the depths of those eyes I saw a warning, a clear, unmistakable message. It was a boundary, a line drawn in the sand. This was its world, and I was the intruder. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the key again. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared back to life. With one last glance at the figure, now receding into the shadows, I drove away. The journey back to the city was a blur, the neon lights a stark contrast to the darkness I had left behind. Yet, I could still feel the Skinwalker's eyes on me, a constant reminder of the world I had just escaped from. Back in my apartment, surrounded by the noise and bustle of the city, I realized something. I had gone to the Navajo Nation looking for a story, a piece of folklore. Instead, I had stumbled into a world that defied all rationality, a world where the Skinwalker reigned supreme. I knew then that some stories were not meant to be told. They were not meant to be understood. They were meant to serve as a reminder, a marker of the boundaries between our world and the unknown. The tale of the Skinwalker was one such story, a chilling echo from the edges of our understanding. I was just grateful to have escaped from it, to have returned from the shadows. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the city lights casting long shadows in my room, I could have sworn I heard a faint howl, a chilling reminder of the world I had left behind, a world that was now a part of me. And so, the tale of the Skinwalker remained untold, hidden in the dusty corners of Navajo Nation, a chilling whisper on the desert winds, a dark legend living in the shadows of our world.